Following the Civil War, the Gilded Age in America created rampant corruption in urban cities. Newspapers, the only major medium of news at the time, saw themselves as the watchdogs over government and business, serving on behalf of the public. However, beginning in New York City, newspapers began to cheat their way out of the public defender role and instead have their real purpose be to gain circulation in a highly competitive environment. This evolved into yellow journalism. Yellow journalism is a term that was coined in the mid-1890s to describe the style of journalism that takes advantage of sensationalism and exaggeration to get the reader's attention. Oftentimes, the real facts of the story are exaggerated in a way that is beneficial to the producer's bias, or the facts are omitted altogether. The use of this style of writing originates with Joseph Pulitzer, who incorporated the sensationalism into publications in the New York World, the newspaper publication that he purchased from Jay Gould in 1883 and now owned and ran. The San Francisco journalist William Randolph Hearst responded to this by incorporating sensational journalism into the papers of the San Francisco Examiner. After finding success in San Francisco, Hearst moved to New York, where he acquired the New York Journal in 1895 to expand his influence, earn more revenue, and grow his own media empire. Both parties examined carefully what caught the eyes of the readers and found that bold, exciting headlines, illustrations and photos, and flashy front-page articles about topics like sex or violence led newspapers to fly off the shelves at a quicker rate. Stories that were perceived as more popular or eye-catching to the consumers were showcased over important stories with boring topics. Almost immediately, Pulitzer began to run stories of murder and crime in the New York World, and later developed a formula that Hearst would later steal: sex on the front page of the paper and morality in the editorials. Pulitzer and Hearst also learned that pictures in advertisements, particularly those in color, increased their paper's circulation. The showdown in yellow journalism arrived in the form of the two biggest newspapers in New York City, Pulitzer's The New York World and Hearst's New York Journal, during the Spanish-American War in 1898. As Cuba fought for independence from Spain, the sensationalist journalism stories of Pulitzer and Hearst about the struggle of the Cuban people created awareness and support in America for their cause. The goal of Hearst and Pulitzer's publications were to take advantage of the sensational aspect of the armed conflicts taking place in Cuba and to antagonize the Spanish troops. Stories and photos of unlawful imprisonment and punishments of Cubans were used by the two media moguls to increase circulation and revenue. Recreated in the famous 1941 film Citizen Kane, Hearst is quoted as telling his artists and correspondents in Cuba that if they continued to furnish the pictures, that he would furnish the war.
Girls delightful in Cuba, stop.
Could send you prose poems about scenery, but don't feel right spending your money. Stop. There is no war in Cuba. Signed, Wheeler. Any answer?
Yes, dear Wheeler, you provide the prose poems. I'll provide the war.
That's fine, Mr. Kane.
Yes, I rather like myself. Send it right away.
Both editors went to great financial lengths to have correspondents stationed in Cuba to supply stories. In January of 1898, President McKinley sent the battleship USS Maine towards Cuba to protect American interests in the region. A month later, the vessel exploded off the Cuban coast, most likely from a mechanical failure. However, this fed directly into Hearst's coverage of the war, and he boldly declared Spain responsible for the so-called attack. Hearst defined it as an act of war on the part of the Spanish. Huge aggressive headlines overwhelmed Americans, leading more and more to believe the Spanish as a ruthless enemy. Many took the story as fact, when in reality it was not. Although many other motives existed for the U.S.'s involvement in the war, this single event and Hearst's subsequent stories have led many to believe yellow journalism as a key cause of America's fervor and participation in the war.
During World War I, yellow journalism began to approach what is better known today as fake news. In 1917, publications in an English newspaper, the North China Daily News, spread the story that battlefield corpses in Germany were being processed into fat to create products like candles, nitroglycerine, lubricant, and even soap. This is a completely fabricated story circulated in U.S. and Allied press and was used as anti-German propaganda. This so-called German corpse factory story is used by Allied forces in an attempt to get China to join their side in the global conflict. This example showed how false news stories could play a big role in how global events were perceived by the public. Also during World War I, President Wilson founded the Committee on Public Information to promote the war and motives for American intervention domestically. This was the first time that the modern government dispersed propaganda on such a large scale. One technique used by the CPI was demonization. They used this to try and convince the public that the war was a war of good versus evil. Posters and pamphlets were made to show Germans as savages and even in some cases devils. By making the Germans represent savages, it raised enlistment rates and also for some Americans justified killing Germans in battle. Dishonesty was also another major problem the CPI brought along. Former CPI members said that the victories were routinely manufactured by American military authorities to boost patriotism. Once the CPI was disbanded, many of the writers stayed in Washington, D.C. and New York where they used skills and contacts to usher in a new era of journalism. Before the U.S. had been launched into World War II by the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Department of Social Affairs and War Department had already begun their campaign of anti-German and anti-Japanese sentiment. Propaganda was spread that depicted the Japanese as monkeys and the Germans as large brutes. This increased enlistment and created an aura of cultural superiority and racism in America.
My name is Professor Gary Metzger. I am a full-time lecturer at California State University, Long Beach, and an instructor of journalism at Golden West College and Chapman University. Before I started in academia, I worked for the Los Angeles Times for almost 25 years. You know, the yellow journalism that was practiced in the 19th century doesn't come close to the fake news that people are bombarded with today.
While sensational journalism in modern times still retains the use of eye-catching titles and pictures, often referred to as clickbait today, over the course of the 20th century, the introduction of new mediums as the TV, the radio, and even the internet and social media have drastically increased the influence that journalism has on people. Just recently, the term fake news exploded in popularity with the 2016 election leading the charge. These false stories have pushed far beyond the level of exaggerations and claims originally used in yellow journalism. With the advent of the internet, spreading stories is no longer restricted to legitimate newspapers. Instead, any news on any website has the potential to be shared millions of times without having first been checked by editors to confirm factual content. Such stories often have the power to sway public opinion and have potentially devastating consequences, particularly in politics. With cable news networks often associating with one side of the political aisle, they are often guilty of not putting the truth out to the best of their ability.
Fox News likes to call itself fair and balanced, but in reality, they only promote the Republican side of issues. MSNBC likes to promote itself as being, as showing both sides of an issue, but in reality, they only show things that interest people who are on the Democratic side. So, and CNN tries to do both and they fail miserably. Has it had a negative impact? Absolutely. Absolutely. There are people who are sucked in to alleged news stories on the World Wide Web that caters to an opinion that they hold close to their hearts and minds. So if they see stories like that hearken to opinions that they have, they're going to believe those more than they will a story that doesn't cater to exactly what they think the worldview is.
Yellow journalism originated as a style of journalism meant to enrich greedy journalists rather than inform the public. Over the years, and especially in times of war, this sensational journalism was used to grab the reader's attention, with the intent of spreading opinionated or false information to gain public support on specific issues. This was used in war to rally support and inspire hate against the enemy, and is more commonly used in modern times in politics in the attempt to sway voters. As technology advanced, the introduction of new forms of media coverage such as the radio, TV, the internet, and social media have made sensational journalism much more widespread and influential. This evolved yellow journalism into modern fake news. The lack of credibility present in modern media stems all the way back to the 1890s with the introduction of yellow journalism, and whether this style of journalism remains popular over credible media coverage is up to the motives of the journalists as well as the readers.